The house buzzed with laughter, chatter, and the clinking of glasses as the Johnson family reunion came to life on a warm summer afternoon. Children raced across the backyard, their shoes kicking up tiny clouds of dust while the scent of barbecue floated in the air. Long picnic tables were lined with trays of food, bright bowls of salad and pitchers of lemonade. Cousins and siblings hugged, their voices overlapping in a joyful chorus, while old friends swapped stories of years gone by. It was a scene of warmth and togetherness, at least for everyone except the woman sitting quietly in the corner. Grandma Evelyn had been the one to hold this family together for decades. She had raised her children through hard times, worked tirelessly to keep a roof over their heads, and sacrificed her own dreams so her family could thrive. Yet here she was, sitting on a folding chair pushed near the fence, watching the reunion unfold as though she were nothing more than a passerby. She adjusted her shawl around her shoulders, her weathered hands resting on her lap, while a small smile played on her lips, though her eyes told a different story. Everywhere she looked, she saw pieces of herself, her son's serious brow as he grilled burgers, her daughter's laughter echoing across the yard, her grandchildren's bright faces illuminated with youth. But no one came to sit beside her. Plates of food were passed around, stories were shared, glasses were raised, but Grandma Evelyn remained unseen, as though time had slowly dimmed her presence in the family she had once been the center of. She remembered when reunions were smaller, when she would spend days cooking, preparing, and ensuring everyone felt at home. Back then, her voice carried weight, her advice was sought after, and her stories brought silence to the table as every ear listened. But as the years passed, roles shifted. The younger generation took the reins, the older ones stepped aside, and somewhere in the shuffle, Evelyn's voice had been drowned out by newer conversations.
At one point, she stood and shuffled slowly toward the buffet table. She reached for a plate, but before she could scoop up any food, two of her daughters-in-law rushed past her, chatting loudly, nearly bumping into her. "Oh, sorry," one said absently, barely glancing at her before continuing her conversation. Evelyn gave a small nod and stepped back, her appetite fading with the realization that she had been overlooked once again. She returned to her chair and looked around. Her grandson Matthew was showing off his new promotion at work, his voice booming with pride. Her granddaughter Lily had brought her fiancé, and the entire table was crowded around them, asking questions about the wedding. Even her youngest son, who used to sit for hours listening to her stories, was caught up in a loud debate about politics with his cousins. Evelyn tried to interject once or twice with a gentle comment, but her voice was swallowed by the noise. Nobody seemed to notice she had spoken at all. She leaned back and watched. For a moment, she wondered if this was what old age truly meant. Not the gray hair, not the aching knees, but becoming invisible to the very people you had given your life to. A pang of loneliness struck her heart, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had always been strong, and strength meant carrying the silence too. Just then, a little girl broke away from the chaos. It was Emma, her youngest great-grandchild, no more than 5 years old. She toddled over with messy curls bouncing and climbed onto Evelyn's lap. "Grandma," she whispered, her small arms wrapping around Evelyn's neck. "Why are you sitting here all alone?" Evelyn smiled, tears prickling her eyes, and kissed Emma's forehead. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured. "Sometimes grown-ups forget where the real stories are." Emma giggled, not fully understanding, but stayed nestled against her. For those few minutes, Evelyn didn't feel invisible. The reunion carried on. Music played, old photo albums were passed around, and the laughter grew louder. Then, as dinner came to an end, someone clinked a glass with a spoon, calling for attention. It was Evelyn's eldest grandson, Jason, now a towering man with graying hair at his temples. "All right, everyone, before we finish the evening, let's hear from the real star of this family, Grandma Evelyn. After all, none of us would even be here if it weren't for her." A hush fell over the yard. Dozens of eyes turned toward Evelyn, and for the first time that day, she felt the weight of the family's gaze upon her. Her heart thumped. She hadn't spoken in front of them in years, not like this. She could simply wave them off and let the moment pass, but something deep inside told her this was her chance. Life had given her the last word. She slowly rose from her chair, leaning on her cane for support. The air seemed to shift, the noise dying down until the only sounds were the crickets in the grass and the gentle rustling of leaves overhead. Evelyn looked at her family, her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and felt a mixture of sorrow and pride. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly, but she pressed on, her courage growing with every sentence.
Evelyn let her eyes linger on each face, her gaze steady, her voice stronger now, as though decades of unsaid words were finally finding their way out. "When I was your age," she continued, her hands trembling but her words sharp, "I thought love was easy. I thought it meant smiles, laughter, and warm dinners at the table. But then came the years when money was scarce, when your grandfather worked 3 jobs, and I sewed clothes from scraps just to keep the children warm. Love was not easy then. It was sacrifice. It was staying up all night with fevers, praying when there wasn't enough food, forgiving when tempers ran short. Love was grit." The younger children, restless a moment ago, now leaned against their parents, oddly still. Even the teenagers, who had rolled their eyes earlier, were glued to her every word. Evelyn's voice carried more than just memory. It carried authority born from endurance. She paused, adjusting her shawl as the evening breeze picked up, but her eyes gleamed. "And let me tell you something," she added, her tone lifting slightly. "None of those sacrifices felt small. Each one was a choice. And that choice, that decision to love through action, not just words, is why we are all sitting here today, together as a family." Her daughter, Linda, blinked rapidly, her hand instinctively reaching for a tissue as her mother's words pierced deeper than she'd expected. Evelyn continued, her voice thickening with emotion. "But somewhere along the way, I became the quiet one. Maybe it's age, maybe it's because the world moves faster now. I see the phones, the endless work schedules, the constant rushing, and sometimes," she admitted, her voice breaking just slightly, "I feel like I've become invisible. Like I'm just a photograph on the wall instead of a living, breathing heart in this family." Gasps rippled softly through the group. Several lowered their eyes in shame, realizing how often they had brushed her off at gatherings, how little they'd asked her about her day or her thoughts. Evelyn smiled faintly, easing the tension. "But I'll tell you a secret. Life has a funny way of teaching us. Just when you think someone's story is finished, life hands them the last word. And today, maybe this is mine."
Her words hung heavy, yet comforting, like the blanket she used to drape across their shoulders as children. She leaned gently on her cane and shifted her stance, gathering strength from the stillness of the moment. "I remember when your grandfather passed," she said, her voice lowering, filled with reverence. "Everyone told me I couldn't go on. They said I was too old, too weak, too broken. But what they didn't know is that love doesn't end when a person leaves. It continues through us. I carried him in my heart, and with that strength, I carried all of you. Every challenge, every tear, every joy we faced after that, we faced together, because I refused to let love die." The silence grew thicker, not from discomfort, but from awe. Even the buzzing cicadas outside seemed to pause, as though nature itself was listening. Evelyn's grandson Matthew, the one who had earlier boasted about his promotion, found himself looking at the ground, his throat tight. He had never realized the depth of the sacrifices that had paved the way for his success. Evelyn's gaze softened as she spoke again, her words tender now. I've seen many things in my years, wars, recessions, heartbreak and loss. But do you know what I've learned? That the most dangerous thing for a family is not hardship, it's forgetting. Forgetting who we are, forgetting where we came from, forgetting to honor the shoulders we stand on. Without remembrance, we are nothing but strangers sitting at the same table. Her granddaughter Lily, who had been excitedly chatting about her upcoming wedding earlier, felt tears sting her eyes. She thought about how she hadn't once asked her grandmother for advice about marriage, even though Evelyn had endured decades of love, struggle, and resilience. Evelyn's hands shook, but not from weakness. Her emotions brimmed over and her voice wavered. I don't need to be the center of attention. I don't need gifts or grand gestures. What I need, what every person in my place needs, is to know that we mattered, that our lives were not in vain, that the lessons we bled for are carried forward by those we love. That is the last word every elder hopes for. By now, tears streamed openly on several faces. Mothers hugged their children tighter, sons and daughters exchanged uneasy glances, realizing how much they had taken her presence for granted. Emma, still sitting on Evelyn's lap, looked up with wide eyes as though she were witnessing the most important story she would ever hear. Evelyn reached for her glass of water, took a slow sip, then let out a small laugh that broke the tension. "Oh, don't look so gloomy," she teased gently, a spark of humor returning to her voice. "I'm here to remind you that family is a treasure, and treasures aren't meant to be locked away until they're gone. They're meant to be cherished while they're here, glowing in the light." Laughter broke through the tears, soft and genuine. Evelyn smiled, her shoulders relaxing. She could see it in their eyes. The message was sinking in. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't a silent figure sitting in the corner. She was the heart, the voice, the wisdom of the Johnson family. The reunion had shifted. It wasn't just about food or catching up anymore. It had become something sacred, and it was Evelyn's words that had transformed it.
Evelyn steadied herself. Her fingers curled tightly around the handle of her cane, though it felt less like support and more like an anchor in this moment of truth. She scanned the circle of faces around her, the same faces she had once kissed goodnight, bandaged after falls, and encouraged when the world seemed too heavy. Their eyes now shimmered, not with pity, but with something deeper: respect, awareness, love rediscovered. She drew a breath, her voice warming with memory. "Do you remember the storm of '82? She asked, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Heads tilted, and a few nodded uncertainly. It was the worst blizzard this town had seen in decades. Roads closed, power lines down, and there we were, huddled in the dark with candles barely giving us light. Your parents were so young then, worried sick about how we'd get through. But we did, didn't we? I made stew from whatever was left in the pantry. We played board games by lantern, and when the wind howled, I sang lullabies to drown it out. We made it an adventure, not a disaster. That's what family does. We weather storms together, and when we can, we turn the storm into a story worth telling." Her grandson Jason chuckled softly, the memory sparking in his mind. "I remember, Grandma. You put socks on our hands when we ran out of mittens." The crowd laughed warmly, and Evelyn's eyes twinkled. "That's right. And no one lost a finger, did they?" The laughter lingered, but it was tinged with admiration. Her face grew serious again. But it wasn't always storms and laughter. There were darker days, too. Days I prayed none of you would ever see. Like the year your grandfather lost his job. We didn't know how we'd keep the house. There were nights I cried quietly so the children wouldn't hear. I pawned my wedding ring to buy groceries, thinking I'd never see it again. But we survived. Because love carried us. Because I believed in the strength of this family. The air thickened with the weight of her confession. No one had ever heard that story before. Her daughter Linda covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling down her cheeks. She had been a child then, oblivious to the sacrifices that had kept her safe and fed. Evelyn continued, her voice stronger, unwavering. Do you know why I share these things? Not to make you sad, not to earn your sympathy, but to remind you that behind every comfort you enjoy, someone bled, someone sacrificed, someone gave a piece of their soul so you could stand taller. That is the invisible thread that binds generations. And when you forget it, when you dismiss the hands that built your foundation, you dishonor not just me, but yourselves. Silence blanketed the yard. The cicadas hummed again, the wind rustled the leaves, but no human dared move. Every word felt like it was etching itself into their hearts. Evelyn shifted, her voice softening. Do you know why I share these things? Not to make you sad, not to earn your sympathy, but to remind you that behind every comfort you enjoy, someone bled, someone sacrificed, someone gave a piece of their soul so you could stand taller. That is the invisible thread that binds generations. And when you forget it, when you dismiss the hands that built your foundation, you dishonor not just me, but yourselves. Silence blanketed the yard. The cicadas hummed again. The wind rustled the leaves, but no human dared move. Every word felt like it was etching itself into their hearts. Evelyn shifted, her voice softening. I want you to know something else. I never resented the sacrifices. I never regretted giving up comforts or dreams. Because when I look at you, all of you, I see the fruit of that labor. I see doctors, teachers, builders, mothers, fathers. I see a family that is stronger because of what we endured together, and that fills my heart with joy. Her eyes glistened, but she did not falter. But what hurts, she whispered, her voice catching, is when I am treated as though my story is finished, as if my words are relics, not living truths. You forget that wisdom doesn't retire with age, it grows. You forget that my love didn't stop when you grew up, it deepened. And you forget that my heart still beats with the same fire that once built this family. A sob broke from somewhere in the crowd. Lily, the bride-to-be, covered her face, overcome by guilt and awe. Evelyn's grandson Matthew wiped at his eyes, embarrassed but unable to hide the emotions swelling inside him. Even the sons, proud and stubborn in their adulthood, shifted uneasily, their throats tight with shame. Evelyn gave them a small, forgiving smile. But I don't stand here to scold. I stand here to remind you of something vital. Family is not built in moments of ease. It is built in moments of sacrifice, in moments where we choose one another over convenience. And if you forget that, then you risk losing what so many before you worked to protect. Her words wrapped around them like a warm quilt. Some shifted closer together, instinctively reaching for the hands of their loved ones. The lesson was not abstract. It was alive, breathing through her trembling but resolute voice. She chuckled softly then, easing the heaviness once more. Do you know, when I was your age, I thought old people had nothing left to say. I used to nod politely, half listening to my elders, thinking their stories were outdated, their warnings unnecessary. And yet here I am, standing in their shoes, knowing full well how wrong I was. Wisdom doesn't retire with age, it grows. It's about seeing the whole mountain, not just the climb in front of you. Heads nodded across the yard. The teenagers who, earlier, fidgeted and sighed were now transfixed. Parents squeezed their children's shoulders. Even Emma, still cuddled on Evelyn's lap, seemed to understand she was witnessing a truth bigger than herself. Evelyn's chest rose with a steady breath. So if I have one last word, if life has given me this one chance to remind you, it's this. Never push aside the ones who built the table you sit at. Don't wait until they're gone to value their voice, because once the silence falls, it cannot be undone, and the wisdom you lose will never return. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. Don't let me be invisible. Don't let any of us be invisible, because the moment you forget us, you lose part of yourselves. By now, tears flowed freely, shoulders shook, tissues passed around, and even the toughest among them could not hold back. The reunion no longer felt like a celebration of food and chatter. It felt like a reckoning, a sacred reminder of the bonds too often neglected. Evelyn sank slowly back into her chair, her cane resting across her lap. She exhaled deeply, her body trembling, not from weakness, but from the weight of truth finally spoken. She had not planned this speech, had not written it down, but it had come from the deepest part of her soul. And she knew, looking at the faces before her, that it had landed exactly where it was meant to. For the first time in years, she did not feel pushed aside. She felt seen. She felt heard. She felt like the matriarch she truly was.
The air was heavy with Evelyn's words, but it wasn't a burden. It was a sacred weight that pulled each heart closer to her. For several moments, no one spoke. The family reunion, which had started with chatter, laughter, and distant cliques, now felt like a sanctuary of reflection. The cicadas hummed faintly in the background, as though even nature itself had bowed in silence to the matriarch's truth. Finally, it was Linda, her eldest daughter, who broke the silence. She wiped her eyes, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Mom, I never knew. I never knew about the ring, or the nights you cried so we wouldn't hear. I thought life was simple back then. You made it seem so easy." She pressed her hand to her chest as tears flowed freely. "I see now how blind I've been. Blind to the sacrifices, blind to your pain, and I am so, so sorry." The sincerity in Linda's voice cracked something open in the others. Evelyn's second son, Robert, cleared his throat, but the emotion choked him. He stepped forward, kneeling beside her chair. "Mom, I've been selfish. I pushed you aside without realizing it, thinking you'd always be here, thinking you didn't need to be included. But you've always been the heart of this family. I just forgot, and I hate myself for that." He bowed his head, clutching her frail hands. Evelyn's lips trembled, but she reached out, patting his cheek gently. "You don't need to hate yourself, Robert. You just need to remember." From the corner, Lily, the bride-to-be, could no longer contain herself. She rushed forward, her white dress flowing behind her, tears streaking her makeup. She fell to her knees in front of her grandmother. "Grandma, I didn't even want to invite you today. I thought you'd be tired, that you'd be in the way. But hearing you, oh, God, I feel ashamed. You're the reason we even have this family to celebrate. I was wrong to ever think you didn't belong here." Her sobs shook her shoulders, and Evelyn stroked her hair like she had when Lily was just a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. "My darling, I'm just glad you see it now. That's all I ever wanted, that you'd remember who we are, where we came from." The ripples spread. One by one, the grandchildren stepped closer, their eyes downcast, their hearts pounding with remorse. Jason, the joker of the family, wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. "Grandma, I laughed when you talked about the old days. I thought you were just rambling stories that didn't matter, but they matter. They matter so much more than I ever knew.
I'm sorry for not listening. Her great-granddaughter Emma, still perched near her, wrapped her tiny arms tightly around Evelyn's waist. I always listen, Grandma, she said with childlike innocence. I like your stories. They make me feel warm. Evelyn's tears finally spilled over, not of sadness, but of joy. She kissed the top of Emma's head. Thank you, my sweet one. You remind me that hope always starts small. The family, once scattered across the yard in little groups, began to close in. Chairs were dragged closer, hands reached out, shoulders leaned into one another. It was as if Evelyn's words had dismantled invisible walls that had stood for years. Her grandson Matthew spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. Grandma, you're right. We've been treating you like you were invisible, like you didn't matter anymore. But you matter more than ever. From this day on, I promise, you'll never feel pushed aside again. Evelyn smiled through her tears. That's all I ask. Not grand gestures, not monuments, just remembrance, just presence. Linda reached for her mother's hands again. You won't just be remembered, Mom. You'll be honored. You'll be part of every gathering, every decision, every story we tell. We'll make sure your voice is heard. The reunion that had once been shallow chatter now became a confessional of love and healing. Stories began pouring out, not just from Evelyn, but from the children and grandchildren. They remembered her meals, her lullabies, her fierce protection when bullies mocked them, her laughter that filled the house on Christmas mornings. Each memory was like a thread, weaving them all back together into something whole, something unbreakable. Robert stood and raised his voice. From now on, we don't just gather to eat and gossip. We gather to remember, to learn, to celebrate where we came from. He glanced at his mother, his eyes shining. And that means making sure Mom is always at the center. A cheer rose, not loud, but heartfelt. For the first time, Evelyn didn't feel like an afterthought. She felt like the heartbeat. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Lily took Evelyn's hand. Grandma, she said softly, would you do me the honor of giving a blessing at my wedding tomorrow? Not just a prayer, but a story. I want your words to be the foundation of the day. Evelyn's eyes widened, her chest swelling with pride. Oh, my darling, I would be honored, more than you'll ever know. The family clapped, cheered, and embraced. Evelyn felt arms around her from every direction, her children, her grandchildren, even little Emma clinging tightly. For years, she had feared fading into the background, becoming nothing more than a name in a family tree. But in this moment, she knew. Her legacy was alive, vibrant, and unshakable. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of gratitude. Life had given her the last word, and it had been enough to heal wounds, to mend bonds, and to awaken love that had been sleeping for too long. As twilight painted the sky in soft purples and oranges, Evelyn gazed around the circle of faces, faces that finally looked back at her with reverence, not indifference. She had been pushed aside, yes, but now she was back at the center, where she belonged. And this time, she knew she would never be forgotten again.
The morning of the wedding arrived with a soft, golden glow. Sunlight streamed through the church windows, casting warm patterns across the polished pews. The family bustled with excitement, flowers were being arranged, the choir rehearsed softly, and the bride's laughter echoed faintly down the hall. But amidst the swirl of activity, all eyes kept returning to one person, Evelyn. She sat in a chair near the front, dressed in a pale blue gown that shimmered faintly in the light. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, and her hands rested calmly in her lap. Yet her presence carried more weight than the grandest floral arrangements or the most ornate decorations.
Everyone in the room knew that today wasn't just about Lily's marriage. It was about honoring the woman who had held the family together in silence for so many years. When the ceremony began, Evelyn watched with quiet joy as Lily walked down the aisle. Her granddaughter's eyes glistened with emotion, and though she held her father's arm, she kept glancing toward Evelyn, her smile tender and full of gratitude. The vows were exchanged, the rings placed, and the crowd erupted in applause as Lily and her groom sealed their promise with a kiss. But before the reception began, the priest turned to the guests. "Today," he said, his voice firm yet kind, "we celebrate not only a union of love, but also the generations that have paved the way for this moment. The bride has asked that her grandmother, Evelyn, bless this marriage with her words."
Her voice, though soft, carried with strength. "Today, I look at my granddaughter and see the continuation of a story that began long before either of us were born. Marriage, like life, is not about ease or comfort. It is about sacrifice, trust, forgiveness, and love that grows even in hardship." She paused, letting the words sink in. "When I was young, I thought love was about grand gestures, but after decades of life, I learned the truth. Love is in the small things, in the patience of waiting, in the courage of forgiving, in the strength of holding on when everything feels broken. That is what builds families. That is what keeps them from falling apart." The audience was utterly silent. Evelyn's words wrapped around them like a blanket, warm yet firm. She glanced at Lily, who was holding her husband's hand tightly. "And you, my dear Lily, remember that you are not alone. You carry with you the strength of those who came before, the lessons of our past, and the wisdom of those who sacrificed for you. Honor that, and your love will endure." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Tears glistened in many eyes, and even the priest looked moved. Evelyn closed her speech with a gentle smile. "So I bless this union with the hope that your love will be patient, forgiving, and steadfast, and that you will never forget the roots that gave you wings." Applause thundered through the church. Not the polite clapping given to speeches, but a standing ovation born of genuine reverence. Evelyn lowered her head humbly, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had been ignored, dismissed, even pushed aside, but here she was, her words the very cornerstone of the day. At the reception, Evelyn found herself surrounded. Family members who had once brushed past her now leaned in to listen, asking her to tell stories, share advice, laugh at old memories. The children clustered at her feet, eager for the tales they once found boring. Even the younger adults recorded snippets of her wisdom on their phones, determined never to forget again. Linda took her mother's hands and whispered, "You gave us the last word, Mom, and it was the word we needed most." Robert added, "You've changed us. You've changed everything." Evelyn shook her head softly, her smile gentle. "No, my loves, I didn't change you. I only reminded you of who you've always been." As the evening wore on, the family danced, laughed, and feasted together. But this time, Evelyn wasn't on the sidelines. She was at the heart of the circle, her presence cherished, her chair always pulled closer, her voice always heard. Later, as twilight settled and lanterns glowed in the garden, Lily approached her grandmother one last time. She knelt beside Evelyn, resting her head on her lap, like she had as a little girl. "Grandma, thank you. Not just for today, but for everything. You gave me more than love. You gave me the strength to believe in love." Evelyn stroked her hair tenderly, her eyes glistening with pride. "That's all I ever wanted, my dear, that you would live a life filled with love, not just for yourself, but for others too." The lanterns swayed in the night breeze, casting gentle light across the family gathered together in laughter and unity.
Evelyn leaned back, her heart at peace. She knew the truth now. She hadn't been forgotten, and she never would be. Her story had been heard, her wisdom embraced, her love restored to its rightful place. For years, she had feared fading into silence, but life had given her the last word, and with it, she had carved her place in their hearts forever. As the stars filled the sky above, Evelyn whispered to herself, "I was pushed aside, but in the end, love brought me back to the center." And the night carried her words like a prayer, weaving them into the fabric of her family's future.